Hello, and welcome back, or welcome in for the first time. Either way, I'm glad you're here. Get yourself settled. Pull the blanket up. Turn the light down low, whatever your version of comfortable looks like tonight, because we're going to be together for a good long while. Before we start, if you're the kind of listener who likes to leave a little trace behind, a comment about where you're listening from, or what time it is for you right now, I always love reading those in the morning, so drop one whenever you like. And if a channel like this is the kind of thing you want more of in your life, a subscribe helps more than you think. That's the only ask for the whole night. Now let's get comfortable. There is a god the old Greeks were so wary of they mostly avoided saying his actual name out loud. Tonight I want to give you one image to hold on to for the next few hours, because everything else we cover is really just circling back to it. Picture a ledger, black leather, worn soft at the corners from use, sitting open on a stone desk somewhere at the bottom of the world. Every name that has ever died is written in it, every name that ever will. And in 3,000 years of stories about the god who keeps it, there is no record, not one single instance, of an entry in that ledger ever being changed to favor him, or a friend, or a bribe, or a mood. That's the whole mystery of tonight's story. So let's just say it plainly, once, right now, and then spend the rest of the night actually finding out if it's true. How does the most honest bookkeeper in the entire Greek pantheon end up remembered as its monster? I'm not going to answer that for you yet. I want you to sit with it the way you'd sit with a question a friend asked you right before bed, one you keep turning over slowly as you drift. Not urgently, just present, humming quietly under everything else. We'll get there. Not yet. First, the ledger has to exist at all. And before it existed, the god who'd eventually keep it had to survive being swallowed alive by his own father. Let's start there. Chapter 1. Swallowed. Let's start small, because the biggest stories always do. Not with a war, not with a throne. With a sound. The particular ordinary sound of a mother in labor in a cave on the slopes of a mountain, and a father pacing just outside, listening for it, the way you'd listen for the click of a lock you were dreading to hear. His name was Cronus, and he was king of everything. The Titans, the sky, the sea, the whole young cosmos. All of it his, won by doing something we're only going to touch lightly here. Because dwelling on it does nobody any good. He had taken the throne from his own father, Uranus, by force, and by more than force, and he had done it so thoroughly that nobody in the family ever quite recovered the trust that gets broken when a son does that to a father. And somewhere in the doing of it, Cronus heard a prophecy that never let him sleep easy again. Gaia told him. So did his own broken father. In whatever bitter way a deposed god delivers a curse on his way out. One of Cronus's own children, the prophecy said, would do to him exactly what he had done to Uranus. You'd think a king that frightened might simply choose not to have children. Kings rarely think that clearly when the fear gets old enough to calcify into a plan, and Cronus's plan, once he settled on it, was almost stupid in its simplicity. And also, this is the part worth sitting with, completely, horribly effective for a very long time. He would eat them, not kill them outright. That's worth being precise about, because it matters for everything that follows. A god's body doesn't stop the way a mortal's does. So when his wife Rhea handed him their first child, a daughter, Hestia, small and new and utterly unaware of what was about to happen to her, Cronus didn't strike her down. He opened his mouth and he swallowed her whole, and she went on existing somewhere inside him, in the dark, alive. Picture Rhea in that moment, because the myths never quite give her the words, and she deserves at least an attempt at them. a goddess, exhausted from labor, holding her newborn daughter for what she must have already suspected on some level would be the only few minutes she'd ever get with her, and handing the child over anyway because refusing meant what exactly? A fight she couldn't win in a family where refusing Cronus had already cost his own father everything. She handed Hestia over, and Cronus ate his own daughter and went back to whatever a king does with the rest of his evening. And Rhea was left standing in a cave on a mountainside with empty arms and a silence that had teeth in it. It happened again with Demeter, again with Hera, again with Poseidon. 4 children, 4 times the same scene: the labor, the small cry, the handing over, the swallowing, the silence after. And by the time Rhea was pregnant a 5th time, you have to wonder what was left of her by then. Not less love. Mothers don't run out of love the way you run out of patience. But something in her had gone hard and precise, the particular hardness of someone who has grieved the same grief 4 times already and has learned against every instinct how to keep functioning through it. The 5th child was Hades. We don't get his birth described in any detail either. Nobody thought to write it down. Or if they did, it didn't survive the thousands of years between then and now, which tells you something about which parts of the story people considered worth preserving. But you can build the scene from what we do know. Rhea in the same cave, the same labor, the same small new weight in her arms. And Cronus waiting just outside, the way he'd waited 4 times already, with the specific patience of a man who has found a solution to his fear and intends to keep using it exactly as many times as the fear requires. "Bring him to me," is more or less what he'd have said if we let ourselves imagine the scene the way the storytellers who came before us always did, filling in what the bones of the myth leave open. Not cruel in his tone necessarily, just certain. A king doing the thing he'd already decided was simply how things were done in this family now. And Rhea walked out of that cave into the daylight, carrying her 5th child toward the same fate as the first 4, and she handed him over. Hades went down into the dark the same way his sisters and his brother had. Is the detail worth dwelling on? Because most tellings rush past it to get to the war, and the war isn't actually the most interesting part of this chapter. What is a god? Inside another god, in the dark, for years. Not nothing. Not a blank, unconscious weight waiting to be freed. Awareness, real, continuous, aware of time passing in a way a trapped mortal never could be, because a god's mind doesn't switch off the way ours does, doesn't get the mercy of forgetting long stretches of unbearable time. He wasn't alone down there, at least. That's the one small mercy the story does offer him. Hestia was already there, and Demeter, and Hera, and Poseidon, 4 siblings who'd arrived before him, each one carrying whatever shape their own version of this waiting had taken, and now a 5th joined them in whatever passes for a room when the room is the inside of your own father's body. Small detail. It matters more than it seems to right now. Whatever kind of god Hades eventually became, patient, methodical, disciplined almost to a fault, some of that got built right here. In this stretch of years, nobody wrote down, in a dark room he shared with people he loved and could do absolutely nothing to help, waiting for a rescue he had no way of knowing was even coming. Because up above, in the actual daylight world, something was quietly, carefully being planned. When Rhea found herself pregnant a 6th time, she made a decision that must have cost her more nerve than anything else in this entire story. She wasn't going to hand this one over. She went to her own parents, Gaia, the earth itself, and in an odd twist of family loyalty, Uranus, the very father Cronus had deposed, still lingering in some diminished form, presumably not entirely sorry to help undo his son's throne, and she asked for their help. They sent her to Crete. She gave birth in secret, in a cave on Mount Ida, to a son she named Zeus. and instead of carrying the infant back to Cronus, she carried a stone. Take a second here, because this is genuinely one of the strangest, funniest, most human moments in the whole of Greek mythology, and it deserves better than the quick mention it usually gets. A stone, wrapped in swaddling cloth, the way you'd wrap a newborn, roughly the right size, roughly the right weight if you didn't look too closely. And Rhea was gambling with everything that her husband wouldn't look too closely. He didn't. Cronus took the bundle from her, the same practiced joyless motion as 5 times before, and swallowed it whole. Never paused, never unwrapped it to check. The king of the Titans, terrified enough of a prophecy to eat his own children one after another, could not tell the difference between his newborn son and a rock. And if that doesn't strike you as at least a little bit funny in the middle of an otherwise heavy story, sit with it a moment longer, because it's supposed to be. Fear makes people careless in exactly the ways they can least afford, and Cronus's carelessness right here is the single crack the entire rest of this myth climbs through. Consider, too, what it must have cost Rhea simply to keep functioning after that 5th handing over, to wake the next morning and the morning after, and carry on being a wife in a household where her husband had just eaten their child in front of her, without the option of grieving openly, without anyone to tell, because who exactly do you tell when your husband is the king of everything, and the crime is one only the 2 of you witnessed? Whatever nerve she found, 6 months or a year later, to actually plan Zeus's rescue, rather than simply endure a 6th loss the way she'd endured the first 5, that nerve had to come from somewhere. And the somewhere was almost certainly those quiet, unbearable mornings after Hades went down. The last of 5, when grief finally curdled into something colder and more useful than grief alone. Zeus grew up far away, on Crete, raised by nymphs, fed on goat's milk from a goat named Amalthea in some tellings, guarded. And this detail is one of my favorites in the whole story, so let me actually give it room, by armored young warriors called the Curetes, who danced around the cave clashing their spears against their shields, loudly, rhythmically, specifically so that if the infant cried, the noise of it wouldn't carry to Corda's ears. Imagine that for a second, somewhere on a mountainside, a baby who is destined to overthrow the king of the universe is crying because he's hungry, or startled, or simply being a baby, and a group of armed dancers are banging their shields together to cover the sound, and it's working, and nobody up on the mountain of the gods has the faintest idea any of this is happening. Hold that image next to the other one. Somewhere far away, a child grows up in sunlight, drinking milk, guarded by dancers, laughing probably the way infants laugh at things that startle them harmlessly. And somewhere else, inside his own father, 4 of that child's siblings are growing up too. If grow is even the word for it. In a dark that never once let up, with no dancers, no milk, no laughter, just each other and the waiting. That contrast is the engine of the whole rest of this chapter, so keep it close. 1 brother in daylight. 4, soon to be 5, once he came looking, waiting in the dark for a rescue that had at least finally begun. Years passed this way. Zeus grew to the divine equivalent of manhood, and eventually left Crete to find out exactly what he'd been born into, found his mother, and Rhea told him everything. The stone, the swallowing, his siblings still down there, still waiting, for longer than anyone should ever have to wait for anything. What Zeus did next tends to get told as a triumphant charge, and it was a triumph eventually. But it started as something much slower and much cleverer than a charge. He didn't march up to his father with a weapon raised. He got a job, became Cronus's cupbearer, in most tellings, working his way patiently into a position of trust, the way a spy would, not a hero. And with the help of Metis, a titaness in her own right and no small part of how this actually got done. Whatever the shorter versions leave out, he prepared something specific, an emetic, a potion made to force violent, thorough sickness. Cronus drank it without a flicker of suspicion, because why on earth would the king of the Titans suspect his own cupbearer of anything? And then, the sources genuinely disagree on the exact order. Some say the stone came up first, some say it came up last, and it likely doesn't change the meaning of the story either way. Cronus began to vomit up everything he had swallowed. Try to actually picture it, because most retellings rush straight past this into the victory lap, and the moment itself deserves better than that. Gods fully grown despite the years spent trapped, because whatever that dark stretch had been, it hadn't aged them the way it would have aged a mortal, hauled back up into the light one after another. Hestia, first or last depending on which teller you trust, then Demeter, then Hera, then Poseidon, and then Hades, blinking, for the first time and longer than any of them could properly count, into actual daylight. No source gives us the reunion. That silence is worth noticing, not filling in with more invention than the myth can bear. It tells you which parts of this story the ancient tellers thought worth writing down, and which parts they simply assumed the listener would understand without being told. 5 siblings, suddenly free, suddenly standing in a world none of them had properly seen since before the swallowing began, facing each other for the first time as equals rather than as trapped company in the dark. There wasn't time to feel any of it properly. That's the part that actually stings, if you let it. The moment they were free, they were handed weapons, more or less, and told, now fight for the world, because Cronus wasn't about to abdicate gracefully just because his stomach had settled, and most of the other Titans sided with him out of loyalty, or fear, or the simple gravity of 10,000 years of habit. The Titanomachy lasted 10 years. 10 years of a war that doesn't really translate into anything a modern listener can picture cleanly. Mountains thrown like stones, the sea and the sky themselves described as shuddering. Battles that read less like combat between armies and more like two forces of weather colliding and refusing to yield. For most of it, neither side could break the other. Zeus and his siblings had fury and youth. The Titans had 10,000 years of simply having always been in charge, and the particular, stubborn confidence that comes from never once having lost anything. What actually tipped the balance wasn't more soldiers. It was 3 brothers the world had nearly forgotten existed. The Cyclopes and the 100-handed ones, monstrous, tremendously powerful, locked away in the deep pit of Tartarus by Cronus himself, because his own father Uranus had feared them first, and Cronus, once he took the throne, had simply never bothered to let them back out. Fear inherited like a bad habit, passed down father to son without anyone stopping to ask whether it still made sense. Zeus went down and freed them, and in gratitude, the Cyclopes forged 3 gifts, one for each brother who would go on to divide the world between them. For Zeus, the thunderbolt, loud, visible, the kind of weapon you throw and everyone for miles knows exactly what just happened. For Poseidon, the trident, capable of splitting the earth and calling storms up out of a calm sea. And for Hades, a helm, not a weapon at all. A helm of invisibility, the cap of darkness, some called it, the helm of Hades and others. And even in the shape of the gift itself, you can already see the reputation being written before he'd earned a single moment of it. His brothers got instruments of raw, visible force, the kind of gift you brandish before a crowd. He got a gift that made him vanish. Don't mistake that for the lesser prize, though, because it wasn't, not by a long way. In the final, decisive battle of the war, it was Hades, wearing the helm, unseen, moving through the Titans' own camp while they had no idea he was there at all, who slipped in and destroyed their weapons before the last great clash had even properly begun. His brothers threw thunder across the sky and split the sea in half. Hades won the war from inside the enemy's own tent, doing the quiet, patient, unglamorous work that nobody ever writes songs about. And somehow, even in victory, that became part of the shape people decided he was. Not a fighter, not a hero, just the one who worked where you couldn't see him. It followed him. Everything follows a god eventually, fair or not, and this particular reputation followed Hades long after the war that earned it was over and forgotten by everyone but him. The Titans fell. Cronus and most of those who'd fought beside him were cast down into that same deep pit that had once held the Cyclopes, sealed there this time by the very children he tried so hard to prevent from ever growing up to do exactly this. The old order ended all at once, and three brothers stood in the wreckage of a 10-year war, with no one left above them and no clear plan at all for what came next. So they drew lots. That's the whole method. Not seniority. Not who'd fought hardest or bled most. Three brothers, standing in the ruin of everything, deciding the entire future shape of the cosmos by something close to a coin flip. Zeus drew the sky, Poseidon drew the sea, and Hades, the brother who'd spent longer trapped in the dark than either of the others, who'd won the war working unseen, whose one gift had been a thing that made him disappear rather than a thing that made him loud, drew the Underworld. The earth and Olympus itself they held in common, belonging fully to none of them, but everything below, every soul that would ever die, from the very first mortal down to the very last one, every shadow-choked river, every gate that would only ever open one way, that fell to Hades. By the fall of a lot, the way you'd hand someone a job absolutely nobody applied for. Here's the detail worth carrying with you as this chapter closes, because the rest of this whole story keeps circling back to it. Hades didn't lobby for the Underworld. There's no version of this myth where he campaigns for it, argues he deserves it, tries to trade Poseidon out of the sea. He didn't refuse it either, the way you might expect a proud god to refuse the worst sounding of the three prizes. He simply took what the lot gave him, the same quiet, unresentful acceptance he'd shown years earlier when he was handed over to be swallowed without a single recorded protest, and he went down to see exactly what he'd been given. Whatever waited down there, it was his now. And what he built out of it, alone, in the dark, with nothing waiting for him but territory and silence. That's where we're going next. Chapter 2. The House with Many Doors. Try for a moment to imagine inheriting a kingdom with no walls, no roads, no citizens, and no rules. Just an endless, formless dark beneath the earth that every mortal who has ever lived, or will ever live, is eventually going to arrive in whether they want to or not. No welcome committee, no maps, just Hades, standing at the edge of a territory that didn't yet have edges, in a silence so total it must have felt, for a while, like being swallowed all over again. He didn't get a palace waiting for him. Didn't get a single soul already living down there to point him in a direction. What he got was raw territory, and an understanding, unspoken but complete, that whatever order eventually existed in this place would exist purely because he built it, one decision at a time, with nobody watching and nobody to answer to but himself. So let's watch him build it, slowly, the way he actually would have. Because the Underworld, the way we know it today, with its 5 named rivers and its gates and its careful geography, didn't arrive pre-installed the moment the lot fell to him. It's easy to forget that, since by the time most of the surviving stories were written down, the Underworld already had its shape, the way a city already has its streets by the time you're born into it. Somebody laid those streets first, alone, in the dark, and it's worth actually walking the ground with him as he does it. Start with the rivers because everything else orients around them, and each one does something specific, which matters because a river that simply flows isn't very interesting. But a river that unmakes you a little every time you cross it, that's worth lingering on. The Styx comes first in most tellings, dark and cold. The river, even the gods themselves swear their most binding oaths on oath. And a god who breaks a Styx oath doesn't just lose face, they lose their voice and their very breath for long stretches of years, a punishment so severe that even up on Olympus, nobody swore by the Styx carelessly. Imagine standing at its bank for the first time, Hades alone, watching black water move past in total silence, and understanding, the way you understand a fact rather than feel it, that this river was going to become the most solemn promise in the entire cosmos, simply because it existed and he had claimed it. Next, the Acheron, the river of woe, slow and heavy, the one most commonly described as the actual crossing point where Charon works his ferry. Though the old sources genuinely disagree about which river gets that particular job, and there's no tidy answer to hand you where the ancient tellers themselves never settled on one. Then the Cocytus, the river of wailing, fed in some tellings by the tears of the unburied dead, souls who couldn't cross because nobody up above had done the small human courtesy of giving them a proper funeral. And so they wept on the near bank, and their weeping became the very water that other souls would eventually have to cross. There's something almost too neat about that, too perfectly cruel to be an accident, grief literally becoming the landscape. Benfleketon, which burns, an actual river of fire, coiling down toward the deepest reaches of Tartarus, because Hades' realm was never going to be only shadow and quiet. Some parts of it needed heat, needed pain, needed a place where the punishment could be unmistakable rather than merely symbolic. And last, quietest of the five, the one most people forget matters most, until the exact moment they need it, Lethe. Its water erases memory. Drink from it, and whatever you were, your name, your griefs, the whole accumulated weight of a life, starts to soften and fade, gently, without violence. Some souls, in the tellings where rebirth is part of the picture, are made to drink from it deliberately, before returning to the world above, a clean slate handed to them whether they asked for one or not. Small detail worth carrying forward, because it pays off much later. Notice that 4 of these 5 rivers punish, wound, or strip something away, and only one of them quietly offers anything resembling mercy. That balance wasn't an accident. It tells you something real about the god designing all of this, alone, with no one to argue him out of any particular choice. Beyond the rivers, Erebus, the primordial dark itself, less a place than a condition, a deep gloom every soul has to pass through before reaching anywhere with actual geography to it. And then finally, the gates, because a kingdom without a border is simply chaos with better lighting, and Hades, whatever else you want to say about him, was never a god who tolerated chaos in his own house. The gates carry one rule, and it's the rule the entire rest of this story keeps circling back to, so let's actually sit with it here rather than just naming it. Souls go in, and they do not come back out. Say it slowly, because it lands differently than it does rush past. Not cruelty for its own sake. Structural necessity, the same way a bank bolt only functions if the door locks from one side. If the dead could wander back up whenever they pleased, there would be no dead, not really. Only the living, briefly and reversibly inconvenienced. Hades seems to have understood from the very start that the entire meaning of a mortal life, the thing that makes choices weigh something, makes love and grief mean anything real at all, depends entirely on that door only ever swinging one way. There's a kindness folded into that cruelty, if you sit with it long enough, late at night, the way this kind of story wants you to. He didn't invent death. He simply refused to let anyone, mortal or god, pretend it wasn't real. Guarding that one-way door, Cerberus. Picture the day he first arrived at the gate, born of monstrous parents, Echidna and Typhon, who between them produced most of the great monsters of that whole age and handed to Hades not as a weapon, but as a problem to be solved. What do you do with something this large, this strange, 3 heads or more depending on which teller you trust, a serpent's tail that moves with a mind of its own, a mane in some versions made entirely of writhing snakes? Hades gave him a job, not attack, not savagery for its own sake. Most tellings describe him as almost gentle toward souls arriving, tails wagging in more than one old account. Because why would he waste any effort being hostile to something walking willingly toward a door that only opens one way? His entire function, the single thing he exists to do, is make absolutely certain that nothing which goes in ever comes back out. Friendly enough going down, an utterly unmovable wall coming back up. It's almost a joke, if you let you'll see it as one, the friendliest monster in the whole of Greek mythology, and also the single most effective lock ever built. That's worth noticing as a pattern actually, because you'll see it again and again across this whole story. Hades didn't build his kingdom by conquering or terrorizing his way into order. He built it by taking what already existed. A monstrous dog nobody else particularly wanted, a river that already ran dark and cold, a titaness's daughter who already knew every soul's true name, and giving each of them a role that suited exactly what they already were. Which brings us to Chiron. If Cerberus is the lock, Charon is closer to the door itself. The ferryman who carries souls across the water separating the living world's last edge from the actual territory of the dead. Ancient in every telling, weathered in a way that even other immortals aren't quite. With an expression the old sources describe as grim, unmoved by anything a soul might say to him mid-crossing, because he's heard every plea and every threat and every desperate bargain more times than there's a number for. He charges a toll, 1 coin, always, and this detail is where something genuinely human snuck into the mythology somewhere along the way, because it was never really about Chiron needing money. What would a ferryman of the dead even spend a coin on? It was about what the coin represented to the actual people telling this story, generation after generation. For centuries, mourners placed a coin under a dead person's tongue or over their eyes before burial, an obol, so the departed soul would have Charon's fare ready the moment they reached the river. Picture the alternative, because the myth doesn't let you skip it. Bury someone without that coin, and their soul might wander the near bank for 100 years, unable to cross, unable to go home, caught in exactly the kind of limbo Hades' whole careful system was built to prevent. It's a strange, oddly tender rule buried inside a mythology that otherwise reads as fairly severe. Pay attention to your dead. Remember the coin, and the crossing goes smoothly. Forget, and they suffer for it far longer than the mistake seems to deserve. That's not really Hades being cruel. That's Hades insisting the way he insists on almost everything down here. That the living or the dead a specific, concrete kind of care, and that carelessness has consequences that outlast whoever was careless. So, rivers with rules, a gate that only opens one way, a 3-headed lock at the threshold, a ferryman whose toll is really a quiet test of whether anyone up above remembered to love you properly. And Hades still hadn't built anything you could call a home. He built that too, somewhere in the deep dark beyond Erebus. A palace raised out of black rock, or dark metal, or in some tellings, something closer to shadow, given weight and shape than any material a mortal quarry could ever produce. Grand, the way a throne room needs to be grand, but without ornament for its own sake. Nobody ever describes Hades' palace the way they described Zeus's halls on Olympus, glittering and gold and built specifically to be admired. Hades' house reads, across every version, as functional. Imposing because the work done inside it was imposing, not because anyone was trying to impress a visitor who was never going to come by choice anyway. And once the house stood, finally, the first souls began arriving. Try to picture the very first one, specifically, rather than the idea of them in general. No name survives, of course. This happened before anyone was writing anything down, before the idea of a first soul was even something the storyteller thought to wonder about. But imagine them anyway for a moment, the way this kind of story wants you to. Someone who had simply lived and then simply stopped, with no precedent anywhere in existence for what was supposed to happen next, because nothing had ever happened next before. They'd have crossed water none of their own dead relatives had ever crossed, past a dog whose entire purpose hadn't existed a season earlier, walked toward 3 judges who had never yet judged anyone at all, in a system being invented, quite literally, one soul at a time, starting with them. Sit in that moment a while, because it's worth dwelling in rather than rushing past. A kingdom with a palace, a throne, gates, a guard, 5 rivers each doing their own particular work, and no population yet at all. The very first souls to cross Charon's water, to pass Cerberus at the threshold, to stand for the first time in a realm that had never held a single dead mortal before them. They were walking into something genuinely, entirely new, not a system with centuries of precedent already worn smooth behind it. A system still being built, tested, quietly adjusted by a god barely out of a 10-year war, working out in something close to real time exactly what kind of ruler he actually intended to be, with no one above him telling him how. What kind of ruler he decided to be gets buried under 3,000 years of other people casting him as the villain. So let's say it plainly here, early, because the rest of tonight depends on you carrying it forward with you. Hades ruled with rules, consistently applied, that did not bend for status or wealth or cleverness or how loudly you begged at the gate. A king died the same as a beggar, judged the same way, walked through the same one-way door. That is not, on its own, evil. It might genuinely be the single least corrupt system in the entire Greek mythology, in a pantheon otherwise riddled, top to bottom, with favoritism and bribery and gods settling old grudges through whichever mortal happened to be standing nearby. Ask yourself quietly, why a god this consistent ended up the one everyone learned to fear? We'll come back to that question more than once tonight, turning it over from a few different angles before we're through. For now, the house stood, the gates were set, the dog was at his post, the ferryman had his toll, and a slow, steady trickle of souls had begun finding their way down into the dark. All that was missing was someone to actually judge them once they arrived, because rules without judgment are just walls, decorative and useless, and Hades, whatever else he lacked in flair or warmth, never once lacked for follow-through. That's where we go next, into the court itself, and the 3 former kings who decided, soul by soul, forever, exactly where each one belonged. Chapter 3, The Court of the Dead. Every soul that reaches the far bank of that river faces the same walk, whether they died a king or a shepherd, whether they lived 80 years or 8 days. Picture it slowly, the way the soul itself would have experienced it. No memory yet of anything but the crossing just finished. A path that isn't quite a road, because roads imply a landscape. And this is something else, something that exists mostly to make an impossible decision feel, at least, like it's happening somewhere. And at the end of that path, 3 men standing at a fork, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus, 3 mortal kings once, chosen after their own deaths for a very specific reason. The mythology is oddly consistent about, across its many tellings, they had been known, while alive, for justice. Real justice, the kind that made ordinary people trust a ruling even when the ruling went against them. All three were sons of Zeus, born of mortal mothers, which meant each of them understood mortal life from the inside in a way a purely divine judge never quite could. Minos, once king of Crete, carries the heaviest load in most versions, the final word on the hardest cases, the ones where the other two disagree, or where a life simply doesn't sort cleanly into either direction. Rhadamanthus, his brother, judged souls from the east, known specifically in the old tradition for an incorruptibility that nothing could move. No pleading, no bribery, no rank moved him an inch. And Aeacus, a third king from an entirely different line, judged those from the west, and in some tellings held a more particular, almost bureaucratic role. Besides, keeper of the actual keys to the underworld, guardian of its literal gates. It's a strange, oddly comforting detail if you sit with it. A dog at the outer gate, a ferryman at the river, and further in, a former mortal king holding a real physical set of keys. Because even a realm built on cosmic principle still needs somebody minding the actual locks. Here's what judgment wasn't, and it's worth being clear about this, since modern imagination tends to picture something closer to a trial. No lawyers, no evidence laid out for debate, no waiting on a verdict. A soul simply stood before the three, and the three simply knew the entire shape of a life, its choices and its cruelties and its small, unremarkable kindnesses, laid open the way it never could be, while the person was still breathing and still capable of hiding, even from themselves. No jury needed, no appeal offered or wanted. Just three men who had been just enough, while alive, to be trusted with the job of being just forever. And where a soul went once judged depended entirely on the shape of the life it had shown. Here's the part most retellings rush past in favor of the dramatic extremes, and it deserves its own moment. Most souls, overwhelmingly most, went nowhere spectacular at all. They went to the Asphodel Meadows, a vast gray field thick with pale asphodel flowers, and there they stayed, not tortured, not rewarded, simply existing in a kind of muted, drifting continuation of whatever they had been. An ordinary life earned an ordinary afterlife, quiet, pale, not quite alive but not exactly suffering either. If you picture the underworld as strictly paradise on one side and punishment on the other, you're picturing the two loudest rooms in a house that is, in fact, mostly hallway. Most of the dead lived, if that's even the right word for it, in the hallway. The exceptional, the genuinely heroic Elysium, described across different eras of storytelling in ways that shifted and expanded over time. Sometimes a green sunlit field somewhere at the far edge of Hades' realm, sometimes a set of islands out past the Western Ocean entirely, the Isles of the Blessed, where the greatest and most virtuous souls lived on in real comfort, sometimes forever, sometimes in the versions that offered a soul the choice, given the chance to be reborn 3 separate times. And if virtuous across all 3 lie, Elysium was never handed out generously. It was rare precisely because virtue, real, tested, consistent virtue, is genuinely rare, and a reward that came easily wouldn't have meant anything at all to anyone who'd actually earned it. And the worst, Tartarus, which deserves a fuller visit later tonight rather than a passing mention here. For now, just the shape of the distance involved, a pit so far below even the underworld itself that in the oldest surviving account, an anvil dropped from the surface of the earth would fall for 9 full days before ever reaching Tartarus, and another 9 days falling from Tartarus's own edge down to its actual floor. That's not really distance being described. That's a metaphor wearing the costume of distance. A way of saying, however far down you already imagine the worst punishment should sit, go further, because whatever waits down there has earned the extra 9 days of falling just to arrive. Small detail worth planting here, because it pays off much later tonight. Quietly, the very first prisoners of Tartarus weren't murderers, weren't tyrants at all in the ordinary sense. They were titans, Cronus among them, the same father who had swallowed his own children, now sealed in the same deep dark he'd once tried to use against his own family. There's a shape to that worth sitting with. The son who spent years trapped inside his father's body grew up to decide forever exactly how deep the worst cell in existence needed to be dug, and exactly who deserved to live in it. Notice, as this chapter closes, what's entered into that ledger we started tonight with, and what isn't. Every soul sorted once by the same 3 judges on the same terms. No entry changed afterward for a friend, a bribe, or a grudge. Nowhere in the record is there a single moment of Hades inventing cruelty for its own sake. The court stands ready now. The Meadows and Elysium and Tartarus each have their first tenants. The machine Hades built, alone, patiently, is running exactly the way he built it to run. Which makes what happens next, the one time Hades reaches up out of his own realm and takes something for himself, rather than simply receiving what arrives at his gate, worth paying very close attention to. Because everything you've just watched him build, methodically, fairly, without a single recorded act of favoritism, is about to collide with the one desire he never quite managed to fit inside a rule. Chapter 4. The Bargain Struck in a Field of Narcissus. Every long-ruling king in mythology eventually wants somebody beside the throne, rather than empty space next to it. Hades had ruled alone for a long time by the point this story picks up. How long exactly, no source agrees, because time doesn't move the same way underground, but long enough that the loneliness of it had settled into something closer to habit than pain. The way an old ache stops announcing itself and just becomes part of how a person carries their body. And then he saw Persephone, and habit stopped being enough. She was Demeter's daughter. Demeter, goddess of the harvest, of grain and growing things, one of the very siblings who had been swallowed alongside Hades all those years earlier, which makes what happens next a genuinely strange piece of family arithmetic. The girl Hades wanted was his own niece, born after the war, after the lots were drawn, raised entirely in the daylight world her mother tended with her whole heart. Persephone grew up surrounded by growing things in the most literal sense possible. Flowers that bloomed because her mother willed them to. Fields that ripened on her mother's own schedule. An entire green and golden world built, quite deliberately, to keep her safe, soft, and close. Demeter did not want her daughter married off. Not to anyone, and especially not to a brother whose entire kingdom was the one place in existence where nothing had ever once bloomed. She kept Persephone close, sheltered in a way that reads, the longer you sit with it, less like ordinary maternal care and more like a mother who understood exactly what kind of world her daughter was growing up in and had decided the only real protection available to her was distance. Distance from marriage, from gods with wandering interests, from her own uncle's loneliness turning, as loneliness in gods so often did in this family, into want. Picture Demeter for a moment, if it helps to picture her, walking her daughter through a favored field in the early morning maybe, before the heat of the day settled in, saying something like, "Stay close today. There are people about," meaning nothing sinister by it, meaning only the ordinary worry any mother carries, and having no idea at all how much that worry was about to be justified. It didn't work in the end. It rarely does in these stories. Zeus, Persephone's father, as well as her uncle, because the tangled family trees of Olympus never once do anyone any favors when you try to draw them out cleanly on paper, either agreed to the match outright or, in other tellings, simply declined to stop it when Hades came asking, which in a family where Zeus's word settled every dispute without appeal amounts to more or less the same outcome either way. Demeter was never consulted. not once. That detail matters more than it might seem to on first hearing, because everything that happens across this chapter and the next is, underneath all the geography and grief, a story about a mother finding out after the fact that the men in her family had already decided her daughter's entire future without her in the room. So the field. Picture it properly, the way this kind of story wants you to. A warm afternoon, a meadow thick with wildflowers, and Persephone with a group of companions, laughing about something small and forgettable, the way young women gathering flowers always are in the moment, right before everything changes. The meadow was thick with narcissus specifically, a flower whose name already carries its own grim little joke buried inside it, since the oldest surviving account describes it as bait planted deliberately by Gaia herself at Zeus's request, or by arrangement with Hades, depending on which teller you trust, precisely because its beauty and its scent was strong enough to pull a curious girl a little too far from her friends. 100-headed narcissus, the old sources say, so fragrant that the whole sky and earth and sea was said to have smiled at its scent. An image worth holding on to, because it makes what happens next land so much harder. The whole world apparently was in on the beauty of the trap. Persephone reached for one particularly beautiful bloom, bent low, both hands closing around the stem, and the earth split open beneath her. Not a slow crack, not a warning tremor first. All at once, the ground simply gave way, and out of it came Hades, driving a chariot pulled by black immortal horses, moving fast, and he took her. The word the old sources use again and again translates roughly to seized or snatched, not courted, not asked, not given even the smallest space to answer yes or no. Persephone screamed. The sources are unusually specific about this detail, more specific than they usually bother being about a young goddess's interior state at all. She called out for her father, for Zeus. And no answer came, because Zeus, up on Olympus at that exact moment, had already agreed to this and had no intention whatsoever of stepping in to undo an arrangement he'd effectively signed off on himself. She called for her mother too, and her mother was too far away, tending fields on the other side of the world, with no idea yet that anything had gone wrong at all. Only one witness heard the whole thing and understood what she was hearing. Hecate, goddess of the crossroads and of things that happen in the dark, who caught the sound of the scream from inside her own cave, but arrived too late to see who had taken her. And Helios, the sun, who sees everything that happens under open sky by simple virtue of being the one lighting it. He watched the entire abduction unfold from his chariot overhead and said nothing to anyone, not out of malice exactly, but because it wasn't his place to interfere in an arrangement two gods and their king had already settled between themselves. Sit with that for a moment, because it's worth sitting with. The sun itself watched a girl get dragged screaming into the earth and simply kept moving across the sky, because in this particular arrangement of power, silence from a bystander wasn't unusual at all. It was expected. It was, in fact, the whole point of how the arrangement had been made, quietly, above her head, by men who never intended to be interrupted. The chariot went down through the crack in the earth and the ground closed back over it, seamless, and the field of Narcissus stood there afterward, exactly as it had a few minutes before, flowers still blooming, breeze still moving gently through the grass, except that one of the girls who had been gathering flowers in it was simply, completely gone, and her friends were left standing there calling her name into a field that had already forgotten she was ever in it. Now picture the ride itself, because most tellings hurry past it to reach the aftermath, and it deserves a little longer than that. A girl who has spent her entire life in daylight, surrounded by things that grow, carried at speed through total darkness by a man she barely knows, toward a kingdom she has never once seen, with no one having asked her a single question about any of it. whatever Hades felt in that chariot, and the old sources are almost entirely silent on his interior state during the abduction itself, which tells you plainly enough which side of this story got the sympathetic telling for the next 3,000 years. Persephone's side of it is not ambiguous in the slightest. Fear, grief, the specific, total disorientation of one life ending and a completely different one beginning in the space of a single afternoon, with no transition offered at all, no explanation, no comfort. Here's where the story gets more complicated than the simple villain abducts victim shape it's often flattened into, and it's worth being honest about that complication rather than smoothing it over in either direction. Later tellings, and later isn't the same thing as less true. Myths shift as the cultures telling them shift over centuries. Describe Hades as, once she arrived, gentle, not forcing anything further on her, offering her the throne beside his own rather than a smaller room somewhere out of the way, offering rule over an entire realm rather than the sheltered, smaller life her mother had planned so carefully for her. Some versions go further still, suggesting that whatever began as seizure eventually became something Persephone herself came to want, power and real partnership both, once the first shock of the taking had finally passed. Other tellings don't soften any of it and treat the whole marriage start to finish as exactly the violation it began as, with nothing afterward changing that. Both readings have survived side by side for thousands of years, and this isn't the place to pretend one of them is simply cleanly correct and the other isn't. What can be said plainly without flinching from it? It began as an abduction, arranged entirely by men who never once asked the person most affected what she actually wanted, and whatever it became afterward doesn't erase how it started. Hold both of those facts at once, the way the story itself asks you to. Down below, in a hall she had never seen before that morning, Hades set a throne beside his own and told her, in the tellings that give him any words at all, that she would be queen here, that this realm, cold and dark as it must have looked to a girl raised entirely in her mother's sunlit fields, belonged to her now as much as it belonged to him. Your want for nothing here is roughly the shape of what he might have said, if we let ourselves imagine the scene the way storytellers before us always have. I know it isn't what you were raised for. Ask for anything and it's yours. She did not answer him, and she did not eat. This detail matters enormously, and we'll come back to exactly why in the next chapter, but plant it here first. Clearly, a soul or a captive who eats the food of the underworld binds themselves to it permanently, whether they intend to or not. Persephone, whether out of grief, out of some instinct she couldn't have explained even to herself, out of a suspicion sharp enough to override hunger, refused every meal set in front of her. Days passed this way. The sources don't agree how many, and time, again, doesn't move the same down there as it does above. A new, unwilling queen sitting in a hall of black stone, refusing to eat, while somewhere far above, her mother had just discovered that her daughter was gone. And Demeter's reaction to that discovery is not a small thing in this story. It is, in fact, the single largest thing that happens across the entire myth, because when a goddess of the harvest grieves hard enough, the whole world starves right alongside her, and that's exactly where we're headed next. A quiet aside here, since we're well into tonight's story, and some of you are probably starting to drift, which is exactly where you're meant to be. If part of you is still listening, take a second, no rush at all, and drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from tonight, or which part of Hades' story has surprised you the most so far. I read every one of them, usually in the morning with coffee, and it genuinely makes this whole thing worth doing. And if a night like this one is helping you get some real rest, a like and a subscribe helps this channel keep making them the long, unhurried way without cutting corners to rush to the end. No need to do anything right now, though. Just settle back in. There's still a good while left, and the story isn't finished with you yet. Chapter 5. The Feminine Demeter searched for 9 days, and the number 9 isn't decoration. The old sources are specific about it. 9 full days of walking the earth without eating, without stopping to rest, a torch burning in each hand, calling her daughter's name into every field and cave and coastline she passed, her voice getting rougher with every hour that nobody answered. Nobody would tell her the truth. Not because nobody knew it, Helios knew, had watched the whole thing unfold from his chariot, but because the truth involved Zeus's own approval and telling a grieving mother that her husband had personally signed off on her daughter's abduction is not the kind of message any god particularly wanted to be the one standing in front of her to deliver. On the 10th day, she finally got it from Hecate, who had heard the scream but never seen who took her, and the two of them went together to Helios, who saw everything, and who, when finally asked directly, plainly, did not lie to her face. He told her the truth without softening it. Hades had taken Persephone with Zeus's blessing to be his queen. And then, this is the detail that tends to get skipped in the shorter versions, but it shouldn't be, because it tells you exactly how casually the men in this story treated what had just happened to her. Helios suggested, not unkindly exactly, but not particularly gently either, that Demeter should simply accept it. A good match, he said, more or less. A powerful husband. Nothing really worth grieving over quite this hard. Demeter did not take the advice. What she did instead reshaped the entire visible world, and it's worth walking through it slowly, because the scale of it is the whole point of the chapter. She left Olympus outright, stopped attending the gathering of the gods entirely, as though the family that had made this decision without her no longer had any claim on her presence, disguised herself as an old woman, and wandered the mortal world in that shape. And for a long stretch of time she simply refused to perform the one function that had always defined her entire existence. She let nothing grow. Not out of spite for spite's own sake, though there was certainly grief and fury tangled up together in it, but because a goddess who makes things grow, once that goddess genuinely stops caring whether anything lives or dies, doesn't have a middle setting to fall back on. The wheat didn't sprout, the vines didn't fruit. Fields that had fed entire cities the year before lay bare and brown, and kept lying that way, season after season, while Demeter mourned somewhere out in the world, disguised, unreachable. Mortals started to starve. That's not a detail the myth softens or rushes past. Actual, widespread famine, the kind that empties villages and turns neighbors against each other over the last stored handful of grain. Picture one household in the middle of it. Because the scale of a famine like this is easy to say and hard to actually feel unless you narrow it down to a single roof. A mother rationing what little grain is left in the jar, giving the last of it to her children first, the way mothers in every telling of every famine in every culture always seem to. She has no way of knowing any of this traces back to a single grieving goddess refusing to let anything grow. She only knows the fields outside are bare for the 2nd year running, and that the gods, whatever quarrel they're having with each other this time, always seem to settle it on the backs of people who never got a vote in the matter. And with mortals starving, the sacrifices to the gods stopped too, because a starving farmer has nothing left to burn on an altar, no fattened animal to offer up, no first grain of the harvest to set aside for Olympus when there was no harvest at all to draw from. The gods up above, who fed in ways that mattered to their own standing and pleasure on mortal worship and offering, they started, slowly, uncomfortably, to notice. Zeus tried messengers first. And it's worth noting, this is the pattern with Zeus throughout the entire story. always trying to solve a problem he personally created without ever actually undoing the thing that had caused it. He sent Iris, the rainbow messenger, to ask Demeter to relent. She refused outright. He sent other gods after that, one by one, each carrying gifts, each offering fresh honors and promises, and each one Demeter turned away without hesitation, because none of them were offering the one single thing she actually wanted, which was her daughter back, whole, unbargained for. Eventually, Zeus ran out of intermediaries and out of any option that didn't involve confronting his own brother directly, and the whole pretense that this could be solved without touching the actual arrangement collapsed under its own weight. He sent Hermes, messenger god, the one who moves between realms more easily than any other Olympian, the natural choice for a job that required going somewhere the other gods generally, quietly avoided, down into the underworld itself, carrying a direct order: bring Persephone back. Picture that scene properly, because it's one of the few places in this entire story where we get something close to a direct meeting between the two brothers over the thing actually at stake between them. Hermes arriving in that black stone hall, delivering Zeus's command plainly, and Hades, who by every surviving account did not fly into a rage, did not refuse outright, did not do any of the things a simpler villain in a simpler story would have done. Listening, just listening, all the way through. He commands it, Hermes says, more or less in the shape the old tellers give the scene. Not a request, and Hades agreed to let her go. Sit with that a moment, because it's easy to skip past on the way to the more famous part of this chapter, and it shouldn't be skipped over so quickly. The god who had taken her without asking, who by every reasonable measure of power available to him could have simply refused his brother's messenger and kept what he had claimed for himself. He let her go the moment the order came from someone whose authority he genuinely respected. That's not nothing. Whatever else you think about how this whole story began, Hades did not, at the one moment that actually mattered most, choose to hold on to her by force against a direct command from above. Set that, quietly, next to how often the other gods in this same mythology simply did whatever they wanted regardless of who objected and kept doing it. But before she left, and this is the detail the entire rest of the myth turns on, the detail that ends up explaining something as large as why winter exists at all, Hades offered her a pomegranate. Some tellings frame it plainly as a trick. Hades knew the rule, knew perfectly well that eating anything at all in the underworld bound a soul to return, and offered the fruit specifically so that whatever Zeus commanded from above, some part of Persephone would always permanently belong down here with him. Other tellings are gentler about his intentions, suggesting it wasn't calculation so much as a husband's plain, almost embarrassingly human wish not to lose the person beside him entirely. Offering something small, almost domestic, a piece of ordinary fruit. The kind of gesture that in any other story would simply be a snack shared between two people who cared for each other, except that down here, nothing is ever just a snack. Take something with you is roughly how the gentler tellings frame it. Just this, before you go. Persephone ate 6 seeds in the most commonly told version, though the number shifts depending entirely on which teller you're listening to, 3 in some accounts, 4 in others. And it's worth noticing that even a detail as concrete sounding as a seed count never quite settled into one single agreed answer across 3,000 years of retelling. Whether she ate out of hunger after refusing every meal for so long, whether she ate out of the exact same instinct that had made her refuse everything else until that point and simply chose differently this once, whether she ate knowing precisely what it would mean and chose it anyway with open eyes. The sources genuinely disagree, and every surviving version carries a slightly different verdict on how much agency to grant her in the one choice that ends up defining the entire rest of her courses. Whatever her actual reasoning, it was enough. When the case came before Zeus, with Demeter demanding her daughter's full and permanent return, and Hades pointing calmly to the eaten seeds as binding, Zeus forced finally to actually rule on something, instead of simply avoiding the argument the way he'd been doing for weeks, split the difference the way kings who don't want to fully alienate either party so often do. Persephone would spend part of every year below, with Hades, bound permanently by what she had eaten, and part of every year above, with her mother, free to walk the fields in daylight again. The exact split shifts depending on the teller, a third of the year below and 2/3 above in the oldest surviving account, half and half in many of the later, more familiar versions, 1 month below for every seed eaten in others still. What doesn't shift across any single version is the consequence that follows from it when Persephone is below. Demeter grieves, and the world above turns cold and bare and unfruitful, exactly the way it had during the searching. And when Persephone returns to the surface each year, her mother's joy floods back into the whole earth all at once, and everything blooms together all at once. The way spring actually seems to arrive, if you've ever noticed how suddenly it happens after a long gray winter. That's the whole explanation. Buried in the middle of a story about grief and a bargain struck under real duress, the seasons exist because one mother's love was powerful enough to shape the entire visible world, and because one daughter ate 6 seeds in a hall of black stone for reasons nobody, including her, has ever fully agreed on since. Small detail to carry forward now, because it becomes the whole shape of the next chapter. Notice that this arrangement did not end with Persephone frozen forever as a victim, stuck permanently in the moment of her abduction. It ended with her holding a genuine, permanent claim on 2 entirely different worlds. Sovereign of the dead for part of every year, daughter of the harvest for the rest of it, which is a strange, complicated kind of power to end up with. Born entirely out of the worst afternoon of her whole life. What she chooses to do with that power, once she stops being only the girl who was taken and starts being, unmistakably, a queen in her own right. That's exactly where we're going next. Chapter 6. What Persephone Became. There's a version of this story that stops right at the pomegranate, that treats the seasons as the ending. Persephone forever cast as the girl who got tricked or trapped or, depending on the telling, made one ambiguous choice in a hall of black stone and never got to be anything else afterward. That version is incomplete, and it does her a real disservice, because everything that happens once the bargain is settled tells you plainly that she didn't stay that girl for very long at all. By the time later stories pick her back up, Persephone isn't described anywhere as a captive simply making the best of a bad arrangement. She's described as queen of the underworld, full stop, with her own genuine authority, her own temper, her own very specific ways of dealing with those who crossed her, and some of the harshest, most memorable punishments in the entire underworld trace directly back to decisions she made herself, not Hades. Take as Caliphus, a minor figure, barely a footnote in most retellings of the wider mythology, but his story is worth telling in full, slowly, because of exactly what it reveals about her. He was the one who saw Persephone eat those pomegranate seeds in the underworld's own orchard, and he was the one who reported it directly to the assembled gods, ensuring Zeus's ruling would bind her below for part of every year, rather than letting her return to her mother free and entirely clear. In some tellings, Demeter herself, furious at him for tattling at the worst possible moment, trapped him under a massive boulder as punishment. And when he was eventually freed from that rock, it was Persephone. Not Hades, not Demeter, but Persephone herself, in the version where she's already fully established as queen, who transformed him into a screech owl for his trouble, a bird of ill omen ever after, condemned to a form nobody welcomes seeing at their window. Picture the moment of it, if it helps to picture it, as Caliphus finally freed, blinking in whatever light reaches that part of the underworld, and Persephone looking at him the way a queen looks at someone who has just reminded her of the worst day of her life and saying nothing at all before the transformation takes him. No trial, no debate, just a queen's decision, made and carried out. Or take the Danaids, 50 sisters who, in one of the mythology's darker threads, murdered their husbands on their own wedding night at their father's command, all but one of them refusing at the last moment. Their eternal punishment became proverbial across the ancient world, carrying water in jars riddled through with holes, forever the water always draining back out before it could ever fill anything at all. Different tellings assign the actual sentencing to different authorities, but Persephone's hand in underworld judgment by this point in the mythology gets treated as a settled fact rather than any kind of novelty. She isn't a passive figure sitting decoratively beside her husband's throne, present in name only. She rules. What's worth noticing here isn't simply that she had power, but what particular kind of power it was, and how differently it worked compared to her mother's. Demeter's power, up above, was the power of nurture withheld. She made the entire world starve simply by declining to make anything grow at all, grief expressed as total absence. Persephone's power, once she settled fully into her role below, was something closer to her husband's: judgment, boundary, consequence applied with her own particular edge. A goddess raised entirely around growing things ended up ruling with real teeth over a kingdom where nothing grows at all, ever. That's not a small transformation to have made. That's someone building an entirely new relationship to power out of the wreckage of the worst thing that ever happened to her, and doing it well enough that later tellings simply assumed, without needing to explain it, that she'd always belonged there. And Hades, for his own part, the sources are strikingly quiet on any tension between the two of them once she settled fully into the role. No affairs credited to him anywhere, in the way Zeus's endless infidelities dominate his entire storyline across the whole mythology. No jealous rages recorded. No punishments handed down against Persephone the way Hera so often punished the women Zeus pursued rather than punishing Zeus himself. Whatever this marriage actually was in its daily texture, and daily texture is exactly what the surviving sources leave almost entirely to imagination. It reads, across thousands of years of retelling, as stable. Two rulers, side by side, running the same careful machine, neither one apparently needing to diminish the other to feel secure in the arrangement. That stability is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it's genuinely rare in this mythology, and rarity is always interesting. Picture the texture of it, since no source hands it to you directly. A throne room in black stone, 2 seats instead of 1. A working partnership between a god who valued consistency above almost everything else, and a queen who had learned, the hard way, exactly what unchecked power from other people could do to a single life, and had decided, once she held some power of her own, to wield it deliberately rather than carelessly. There's something almost domestic in the picture, if you let yourself imagine it plainly. Not romance in the way the myths dress up Zeus's various pursuits, but partnership, the unglamorous kind, built out of shared work rather than shared passion. 2 people who each carry the ledger some evenings, and hand it off to the other on the nights they can't. Small detail worth planting here, because it recurs later on. Persephone is also, in several tellings, approached by other gods and by mortals seeking her specific favor separately from her husband's. She has her own petitioners, her own cult worship in certain regions distinct entirely from any joint worship of Hades, her own name invoked separately in certain rites and offerings. A queen with her own following isn't a decorative wife. She's a second center of gravity in a kingdom that, by every account, could easily have gotten by with only one ruling voice and chose not to. None of what she built erases the abduction, and it shouldn't. It happened. It was wrong by any standard. A modern listener or an ancient one would recognize plainly, and nothing that came afterward retroactively fixes it. But she did not remain only what happened to her that afternoon in the field. She built a throne, a reputation of her own, a ledger of her own, in a manner of speaking. Punishments handed down under her own authority to people who crossed her specifically, not her husband. Whatever else this marriage was, it made room for that, because down below, while the queen was settling steadily into her own authority, other souls were arriving too. Souls who hadn't earned the quiet gray drift of the Asphodel Meadows, hadn't earned Elysium either. Souls who had broken something while they were alive badly enough that Hades and Persephone together decided the ordinary machine of judgment simply wasn't punishment enough on its own. Those are the stories everyone actually remembers best when they picture the underworld. The boulder, the water that never rises, the wheel that never once stops turning. And it's time now to spend real time inside them, not as a list of grim trivia recited quickly, but as the character studies they actually are underneath. Chapter 7. Thost broke the rose. Every kingdom has its famous prisoners, the ones whose names outlive the crimes that put them there in the first place. The underworld has 3 that echo louder than the rest, and each one earns his punishment through a slightly different kind of failure. Worth noticing, because it's easy to lump them all together as simply people who made Hades angry, and that flattens what's actually a fairly precise, almost surgical system of consequence. Start with Sisyphus because his story is the funniest one in the whole underworld, and also, underneath the humor, the one that says the most about what Hades actually valued above almost everything else. Sisyphus was king of Corinth in life, and by every account a genuinely brilliant man, clever enough that the cleverness itself became his undoing, in the specific way mythology so loves to punish exactly the trait that made someone impressive in the first place. His crimes varied by teller, cheating guests who trusted his hospitality, betraying the secret of Zeus's to a river god in exchange for a favor, generally treating cunning as a tool for getting away with things rather than for anything more admirable. Eventually, as it does for everyone eventually, his number came up. Death itself. Thanatos in most tellings, the personification of death, not Hades directly, since the 2 roles were never quite the same job, arrived to collect him. And Sisyphus, being exactly who he was, tricked him. Picture the scene the way the old tellers give it to us. Thanatos arrives with a set of chains ready to bind Sisyphus and lead him below. And Sisyphus, instead of resisting outright the way anyone else might, tilts his head with a kind of easy curiosity and says something along the lines of, "Those are remarkable. I've never seen chains like that. How do they even work?" Thanatos, perhaps a little too used to nobody ever questioning his methods, a little flattered even, if death can be flattered, obliges, demonstrates, locks the chains onto himself to show how they hold. And Sisyphus simply leaves him there. Death, chained, unable to perform his one function, which meant that for a stretch of time, nobody anywhere in the whole mortal world could actually die. Battles were fought, and nobody fell. Old age reached its natural end and simply kept going past it. Sacrifices to the gods dried up in a strange mirror of Demeter's famine because the whole religious system depended on mortality functioning correctly, and it had simply, quietly, stopped. Eventually, accounts differ on exactly who intervened, Ares, in some tellings, furious that his battles had lost all their stakes, since a war where nobody dies isn't really a war at all. Zeus himself in others, Thanatos was freed, and Sisyphus was finally collected properly and delivered down to the underworld where he belonged. Except he wasn't done yet. Before he died the proper way, in a piece of forward planning almost nobody else in the whole mythology bothers with, Sisyphus had instructed his wife quietly beforehand not to perform the proper funeral rites for him. No coin for Chiron, no offerings at all. And when he arrived in the underworld improperly buried, he went straight to Persephone and made his case. "My wife has dishonored me," he told her, more or less, in the shape the old tellers give the scene. No coin, no rights. I should be allowed to go back, briefly, and see it done properly, and see her punished for the disrespect. Persephone, whose own judgment, as we've just spent a whole chapter establishing, was sharp and not easily fooled by much of anything, granted it anyway, moved by what read, on its surface, as a perfectly legitimate grievance about proper burial, exactly the kind of complaint the underworld took genuinely seriously. Sisyphus went back up and simply didn't return. He lived out the rest of a full, natural life on the surface in defiance of death twice over now, before old age finally, genuinely caught up with him the ordinary way. When he died the second time, there was no trick left to play. No more chains to spring on an unsuspecting Thanatos, no more petitions to file with a sympathetic queen. He was delivered back to the underworld for good this time, and this time, Hades decided the punishment needed to match the crime with a precision that's almost elegant, if you let yourself see it that way. An eternity of pushing a massive boulder up a steep hill, only for it to roll back down again every single time, right before it ever reaches the top. Small, dry joke worth sitting in for a second, because the humor is genuinely there if you look for it. Notice that the punishment isn't torture in any bloody, dramatic sense at all. It's futility, effort that produces nothing forever for a man whose entire life had been defined by clever effort producing exactly the outcome he wanted every single time, right up until it didn't. Hades didn't punish Sisyphus by taking away his strength or his cleverness. He punished him by making both of those things permanently, eternally useless, which is a far crueler joke, honestly, than any whip or any fire, and precisely, deliberately tailored to the one man in the whole mythology, arrogant enough to think he could outplan death itself, twice. Next, Tantalus, whose crime is worse than Sisyphus's in almost every measurable way, and whose punishment matches that difference exactly. Tantalus was a son of Zeus, welcomed at the actual tables of the gods themselves, trusted enough to dine on Olympus as an honored guest, which tells you something about the standing he'd built for himself before all of this. What he did with that trust is one of the darkest single acts in the entire mythology, and it's worth saying plainly, without softening it, to test whether the gods were truly all-knowing, or perhaps simply to show off his own audacity to a room that had never doubted him. He killed his own son, Pelops, cooked the boy, and served him to the gods at a banquet, as though it were ordinary meat. Every god at that table recognized the dish for exactly what it was and refused to touch a single piece of it. Every god except Demeter, who, still deep in her grief over Persephone in the tellings where the two stories overlap in time, ate a piece of the boy's shoulder without noticing what she was actually eating, her mind somewhere else entirely. The gods, horrified once they understood, restored Pelops to life afterward, replacing the missing shoulder with one carved from ivory. And Tantalus was cast down to face a punishment so precisely fitted to his crime that it has given the English language an entire word, tantalize, because of exactly how well it suits a man who tried to feed his own child to gods who could see everything he ever did. He stands eternally in a pool of water that reaches to his chin beneath a branch heavy with fruit hanging just above his head. When he bends to drink, the water recedes before it ever reaches his lips. When he reaches up for the fruit, the branch lifts itself just out of range. Endless thirst, endless hunger, endless nearness to relief that never once actually arrives. A man who tried to deceive the gods with a feast spends eternity starving within arm's reach of one, forever almost touching what he needs, never once actually holding it. And Ixion, a name less famous than the other two, but whose crime cuts closer to the bone of what the gods actually protected most fiercely of all: trust, hospitality, the sanctity of a guest's place at someone else's table. Ixion murdered his own father-in-law in most tellings by trickery, specifically to avoid paying a bride price he owed, a betrayal of the most basic guest-host bond the ancient world recognized as close to sacred. No mortal king would purify him of the blood guilt afterward, which left him wandering, unwelcome everywhere he went, until Zeus himself, in an act of mercy that Ixion would go on to repay with total, staggering contempt, took him in, purified him personally, and welcomed him to Olympus as an honored guest. Ixion repaid that mercy by attempting to seduce Hera, Zeus's own wife, inside Zeus's own house. Zeus, testing whether the accusation reaching him was even true, shaped a cloud into Hera's exact likeness. Nephele, some tellings name her. And Ixion, unable to tell the difference, attempted exactly what he'd been suspected of doing. His punishment, bound eternally to a wheel of fire, spinning without pause, forever, going nowhere, gaining nothing, exactly the way his ambition had reached, for something that was never his to have and spun endlessly, without ever actually arriving anywhere. Picture Ixion on that wheel for a moment before we move past him, because it's easy to let the punishment become just a striking image rather than an actual eternity. No pause between rotations. No moment where the fire dims enough to think clearly or grieve properly or even fully register what's happening before the next turn begins. Whatever Ixion was, ambitious, treacherous, willing to abuse a mercy that had saved his life once already, the wheel doesn't leave him room to become anything else ever again. That's worth sitting with, uncomfortably, for just a moment before we move on to what these three punishments add up to together. 3 punishments, 3 very different crimes, and worth noticing, as this chapter closes, how precisely each one was fitted to what the man had actually done, rather than handed out generically off some standard list. Futility for the man who tricked death itself with clever schemes that produced nothing lasting in the end. Starvation within reach of plenty for the man who abused a feast to test the god's own knowledge. Endless spinning, going nowhere at all, for the man who betrayed the one relationship, a guest's sacred duty to his host that every civilization in the ancient world considered close to untouchable. That precision is Hades all over, the same god who built rivers that each did something specific rather than one undifferentiated river of general misery, the same god who let a court of former mortal kings weigh each life on its own terms rather than sorting everyone by a single blunt, careless rule. Punishment down here was never random and never simply vindictive. It was, in every single case worth naming, a mirror held up precisely to what the crime had actually been, which is a strange, almost artful kind of justice to find at the bottom of the one place people were most afraid of in the whole ancient world, and worth remembering the next time this god gets flattened into a simple villain in someone else's shorter retelling. But rules built this precisely inevitably attract another kind of visitor. Not souls sent down by ordinary death, but the living, arriving on purpose, trying to bend a system that was never designed to bend for anyone at all. Some of them came with grief so total it moved even Hades to tears. Some came for glory and a fair fight. Some came for spite, and one came for something so far beyond his rights that it very nearly cost him everything he had. That's where we're going next. Chapter 8. The living must can knocking. Most visitors to the underworld arrive once and stay forever. A small handful of the living manage to walk in on their own 2 feet, make their case, and, in a rare few instances, walk back out again afterward. Each of them tested Hades' order in a completely different way, and each encounter tells you something new about exactly where his limits actually sat and where they didn't. Start with the one everyone already half knows, because it's the saddest, and grief is the only key that ever came close to genuinely working on this particular lock. Orpheus was the greatest musician who ever lived, mortal or otherwise, a lyre player whose songs could move stones to weep, could calm wild animals mid-hunt, could, in some tellings, briefly quiet even the rivers themselves as they passed. He married a woman named Eurydice, and their happiness by every account was total and devastatingly short-lived, because on the day of their wedding, or shortly after depending on the telling, Eurydice stepped on a snake while walking through tall grass, was bitten, and died before anyone could reach her in time to help. Orpheus did not accept it. Where every other grieving mortal in this entire mythology eventually learns, slowly and painfully, to live with loss, Orpheus decided instead to simply go and get her back. An idea so audacious that nobody before him had seriously attempted it, because everybody understood on some level that the gate only ever opened one way. He went down anyway, charmed his way past Chiron, past Cerberus, using music rather than force. The sources describe the great dog going quiet, head lowering, and the ferryman letting him cross without a word, not because Orpheus overpowered either of them, but because his grief, turned into song, was strong enough to move even the guardians whose entire function was to stay unmoved by anything a visitor said or did. And he stood finally before Hades and Persephone themselves in that hall of black stone. And instead of pleading in ordinary words, he simply lifted the lyre and played. What he played, the old sources say, was a song about love and loss, so complete, so devastatingly specific in every small detail that even the Furies wept. The Furies, mind you, spirits of vengeance whose entire existence was built around punishing wrongdoing without a shred of mercy, and even they cried at what this one mortal man was singing about the wife he'd lost. Sisyphus, in some tellings, paused his boulder mid-push to listen, just for the length of the song. Ixion's wheel slowed on its axle. For one song's length, the whole machinery of the underworld, the punishments running on their eternal repeat, the judgment continuing without pause, the way it always had, simply stopped, because grief this pure had earned, briefly, the right to be heard rather than processed like everything else that passed through those gates. Hades wept too, in the tellings that give him any interior life at all. And it's worth sitting with that image for a moment, because it's one of the only times in this entire story anyone describes him crying. This is a god who watched his own father swallow him whole, who fought through a 10-year war, who built an entire kingdom out of absolute nothing and ran it without flinching for centuries on end. And a mortal man's song about his dead wife was the thing that finally cracked something open in him that nothing else in all that time ever had. Enough, he might have said in the shape the old tellers give the moment, his own voice unsteady in a way it never was for anyone else who ever stood in that hall. Enough, she can go. One condition, and the condition is the entire point of the story, so it's worth stating exactly, plainly, the way it was actually given, Orpheus would walk ahead out of the underworld, and Eurydice would follow behind him, and he was not, under any circumstances at all, to look back at her until they had both fully reached the world above and stood in daylight together. Not a punishment, a test, or perhaps simply a structural necessity of how the boundary itself actually worked. But either way, absolute, and Orpheus agreed to it instantly, because there was no version of this offer where he wouldn't have. The walk back up is one of the great sustained stretches of tension in the whole of Greek mythology, and it's worth dwelling in properly rather than rushing straight to the ending. Everyone already knows by heart. Darkness the entire way. Silence, except for his own footsteps echoing, and somewhere behind him, footsteps that might have been hers, or might have been nothing at all. Because a god that generous with a rule can also be exactly that precise about not offering a single scrap of comfort beyond it. No voice to answer him if he called out to check. No way at all to know. Walking blind through the dark with everything he wanted just a few feet behind him, whether she was actually there, or whether he was walking home entirely alone. He almost made it, right at the very edge. Some tellings say the exact threshold, the last single step before actual daylight touched him. The doubt became simply unbearable, and Orpheus looked back. Eurydice was there. For one single instant she was there, close enough to see her face clearly, close enough that if he'd simply had one more second of resolve, none of the rest of this would ever have happened. And then she slipped backward into the dark, pulled by the same rule that had let her follow him this far in the first place, gone this time permanently, because the gate does not open twice for the same soul under the same terms. And Hades, however moved he'd been by the song, however real his tears, was never once going to bend that particular rule a second time for anyone. Orpheus reached for her and caught nothing but air. The sources describe him trying to go back down after her immediately, right there at the threshold, and being refused entirely. Charon, this time, would not ferry him across a second time, because the exception had already been made once, and once was the whole of what grief had earned him, no matter how loudly he begged at the water's edge. He spent the rest of his life, in most tellings, wandering, refusing all other companionship, playing music so sorrowful it eventually contributed to his own violent death at the hands of women he'd spurned. But that part of the story belongs to Orpheus alone, not to Hades, and this isn't the place to follow it any further tonight. What matters here for this particular story is what the whole episode actually reveals. Hades was capable of mercy, genuine and total, further than he'd extend to anyone else across the entire rest of this mythology. But even that mercy had exactly one condition, stated plainly, and once it was broken, it stayed broken, permanently, without exception. That's not cruelty. That's the same consistency that ran every other part of his kingdom, applied, this one time, to an exception he never had to grant in the first place. Next, a visitor who didn't come asking for mercy at all, but for a fight, fair and square. Heracles' 12th and final labor, assigned by King Eurystheus, specifically because it was assumed, by everyone including Eurystheus himself, to be flatly impossible, was this: descend into the underworld and bring back Cerberus alive without using a single weapon. He went down through a cave entrance at Titanomachy, guided partway by Hermes and Athena, and made his case directly to Hades. Not sneaking in, not resorting to trickery the way Orpheus and Sisyphus each had in their own way, simply asking outright, the way you'd ask a king for a favor you already knew was enormous. And Hades, in a detail that tells you something real and worth noting about how he actually operated when approached honestly rather than through deception, agreed. On one condition, stated plainly: Heracles could take the dog if he could subdue him using nothing but his own bare strength, with no weapons of any kind allowed. beat him with your hands, is roughly the shape of what Hades tells him in the old tellings that give him dialogue at all. Nothing else. If you can, he's yours to borrow. The wrestling match that followed is described across different tellings as brutal and close-fought. Cerberus's serpent tail, in some versions, biting at Heracles even as the hero got his arms locked around the dog's throat or throats, straining with everything he had. Heracles won eventually through sheer grinding strength and carried Cerberus bodily up to the surface, presented him to a genuinely terrified Eurystheus, who reportedly hid inside a large storage jar at the very sight of the beast, refusing to even come out until Heracles agreed to take the dog straight back down. And Heracles did exactly that, honoring the arrangement to the letter, bringing Cerberus back down afterward exactly as he promised he would. Notice what's actually happening in this story, because it's easy to read it quickly as simply hero beats monster and moves straight on. Hades didn't have to allow the attempt at all. He could have refused outright, and by every measure of raw power available to him, could very likely have made good on that refusal without much trouble. Instead, he set fair terms, no weapons, straightforward physical contest, nothing hidden or rigged, and honored the outcome fully when Heracles won it clean. That's not villainy. That's a king willing to be tested on his own terms, and gracious enough to accept a fair loss without resentment, which is a genuinely rare quality to find anywhere in this mythology, let alone in the one god everyone else remembered as the frightening one. Not every visitor got treated so fairly, though, and the difference in how Hades handled the next pair of guests tells you exactly where his patience actually ran out for good. Theseus and Persephone, two of the era's most famous heroes and closest friends, made a pact together that has to rank among the most audacious in the entire mythology, since both had already claimed daughters of Zeus as brides in earlier adventures. They decided their next wives should be nothing less than goddesses outright, and Persephone, with a confidence that reads, in hindsight, as close to suicidal, suggested Persephone as Persephone herself. They went down together to ask Hades for her hand, which is worth pausing on for a moment because the sheer nerve of it is almost impressive, purely on its own terms. Two mortal men walking directly into the underworld to request that its king simply hand over his own wife to one of them. Hades, according to the sources, didn't refuse them outright on the spot, didn't strike them down the moment they finished asking, the way you might reasonably expect. He offered them seats instead, a show of hospitality, seemingly gracious, seemingly patient, the kind of welcome that put them instantly at ease. Sit, he tells them more or less, in the old telling. Rest a while before we discuss it properly. The seats were a trap. The moment Theseus and Persephone sat down, they found themselves bound to the stone, unable to rise no matter how they strained against it, held fast by chairs of forgetfulness that stripped away both memory and the will to leave at the same time. This is Hades' version of a joke, and it's a genuinely dark one when you sit with it. No confrontation, no violence, just a patient, elegant lie disguised as ordinary hospitality, punishing two men's arrogance by giving them exactly what their arrogance actually deserved. A comfortable seat they would never be able to leave again. They sat there for years. Theseus was eventually freed by Heracles during that same 12th labor that had brought him down after Cerberus, pulled free by main strength, though some tellings say part of him, or part of what he'd been sitting on, stayed behind, a small permanent cost for even the attempt. Persephone was not so fortunate. In most versions, he remains there still, bound to that chair forever, because his crime, reaching for another god's wife specifically by name out loud, was judged, apparently, as 1 degree worse than his friend's mere presence beside him, and mercy however available it clearly was elsewhere in this same story, was never going to extend quite that far. And then there's the visitor who never actually came down into the underworld at all, but whose actions reached Hades from above so directly, so repeatedly, that it triggered the one moment in this entire story where Hades' famous, unshakable patience genuinely broke. Asclepius, son of Apollo, became so skilled a healer, trained in part by the wise centaur Chiron himself, that he began doing something no mortal, however gifted, was ever meant to do, raising the dead, one by one, back into the world of the living. Several accounts survive of specific people he brought back. Hippolytus, in one version, restored to life after being killed by his own horses. Others, in other tellings, entirely. And each resurrection was, from where Hades stood watching, a direct theft. Every single soul Asclepius pulled back across the boundary was a soul who belonged, by the single fundamental rule the entire cosmos was built on the other side of that one-way gate, permanently. Hades did not go to Zeus quietly this time, the way he'd endured so much else, silently, across this whole story. He complained, the sources are specific that this was Hades actively, personally lodging a grievance, arguing directly that Asclepius's healing was actively unbalancing the whole order of the world, undermining the entire structure that made mortal life mean anything at all. And Zeus, agreeing with him, and perhaps also uneasy himself at a mortal growing powerful enough to make gods and mortals functionally interchangeable, struck Asclepius down with a thunderbolt. Notice the shape of that response, because it's the exception that proves everything this whole story has been quietly building toward. Hades did not rage at Sisyphus's trickery beyond assigning him one fitting, precisely tailored punishment, did not refuse Heracles a fair contest on his own terms, did not strike down Orpheus for simply daring to ask. The one time he actually pushed hard enough to get Zeus to kill someone over it was when a mortal, operating entirely from above, in broad daylight, without ever setting foot in the underworld at all, started quietly unmaking the one single rule Hades had built his entire kingdom around from the very first day that death, once it happened, stayed happened for everyone, forever, without exception. Everything else he could bend for when the asking was honest and the terms were fair. That one rule, apparently, was the single thing in the whole cosmos he would not let anyone touch, not even, in this case, by fighting the offender directly himself, but by making certain, quietly and effectively, that the offender's own father was the one who dealt with it. That's the shape of the god this whole chapter has been building toward. Slowly, one visitor at a time, patient with honest requests, gracious in fair contests, win or lose, willing to bend even his most sacred rule once for a grief that had genuinely earned it, and immovable, completely, the one time someone tried to unmake the rule itself rather than simply ask permission to bend it, just this once, the way everyone else had. Add it to the ledger if you're keeping one the way we started tonight. Patient with honest requests, gracious in fair contests, mercy granted once, and never cheapened by granting it twice, and immovable only when someone tried to unmake the rule itself, rather than simply ask to bend it. A few more rooms in this house are worth walking through before we're done. What people actually called him when they weren't afraid to speak at all. The two small cracks in an otherwise remarkably steady marriage, and one debt repaid at a graveside that had nothing to do with tricks or bargains, only strength, honestly used. Then, near the very end, someone who actually lived down there is going to tell us something that complicates all of this. It's worth hearing him out. Chapter 9. The name nobody wanted to speak. Imagine a farmer, an ordinary man, standing at the edge of his own field at dusk, a black ram on a lead beside him waiting for the last of the light to go. He doesn't say the name out loud. Nobody taught him to say it out loud. He calls the god of this particular offering Plauton instead, the wealthy one, and if you'd asked him why, standing there in the half-dark, he might not have had a clean answer beyond. That's simply what you call him when you're this close to asking him for something. That single choice, one god, two names, used in two entirely different registers, tells you almost everything you need to know about how the ancient world actually felt about this figure underneath the fear that gets all the attention in the shorter versions of this story. Hades, as a word, traces back to something like the Unseen One, a name built out of absence rather than presence. You don't call Zeus the Loud One as his primary title, even though he was, but you call this one Unseen, because his whole kingdom is defined by what ordinary eyes can't follow into it. Plauton is the other name, and it was, in the actual daily religious life of the ancient Greek world, the more commonly spoken one, spoken out loud at altars by farmers and priests and grieving families, in a way Hades rarely was. The logic isn't complicated once you walk through it once. Everything valuable that comes up out of the ground, gold, silver, iron, every metal, a household or a temple ever prized, comes from underground, from his territory, in the plainest possible sense. He wasn't only the king who received the dead. He was, by simple and constant extension, the source of every buried good thing too. Picture that farmer again, this time at harvest, not at a funeral, pulling grain from soil that same god's territory had quietly fed from below. Same god, same ground, two entirely different moods entirely. That's the ledger widening out a little if you let it, not only an account of losses, an account of everything that ever came up out of the earth as well. The worship itself carried that same duality. At night, typically, rather than daylight, black animals rather than pale ones, chosen deliberately. And here's the detail that tells you the most. If you actually stop on it rather than letting it pass, the priest turned his face away from the altar as the offering was made. Not disrespect, something closer to the specific discomfort of looking straight at something too large and too permanent to hold in the steady gaze for very long. You can glance at the sun and look away without shame. Some things this culture seemed to understand you only ever approach sideways. And once a year at Eleusis near Athens, that sideways approach became something much larger, an institution that ran without interruption for well over 1,000 years, built entirely around the story of Demeter's grief and Persephone's return. Initiates swore themselves to total secrecy about what actually happened inside those rites, a secrecy so complete that historians today still can't say with certainty what the ceremony itself involved. What we do know is the promise attached to it. Initiates walked out believing they would face their own death differently, not painlessly, but without the same raw terror that gripped everyone who hadn't gone through it. Picture one of them, walking home from Eleusis in torchlight, having just been told by the single most trusted religious authority available to them that the door at the end of their life wasn't quite what they'd always assumed. You don't build a 1,000-year institution around comforting people about a monster. You build it around a god people had quietly, carefully learned to trust, even while they were still too uneasy to say his name out loud in ordinary conversation, over dinner, in front of their own children. Fear and trust, sitting right next to each other. Hold both, the way that farmer held both, the way an entire civilization held both for 1,000 years, and keep walking. There's more in this house worth seeing yet. Chapter 10. The two names in the margin. Every ledger this careful has a margin, and every margin, if you look closely enough, has a note or two that doesn't quite fit the clean columns. Hades has two. Only two across the entire span of Greek mythology. Worth saying plainly, since Zeus alone would need an entire second book just to hold his. The first is Minthi, a nymph of the river Cocytus, already part of his own household. Notice, not some outside temptation he went looking for. In the version worth telling here, she boasted openly to anyone who'd listen that she was more beautiful than Persephone and more deserving of the throne beside Hades. Let him hear it from me. She said to have told the other river spirits, certain enough of herself not to lower her voice about it. See which one of us he actually chooses. Word reached Persephone the way word always does, and her answer wasn't aimed at her husband at all. It landed entirely on Minty. She turned her into the mint plant, the very one still growing today, still carrying something close to her name in half the languages of Europe, crushed underfoot rather than admired standing. Its scent only released by being trodden on. Notice where the anger actually goes in that story, because it matters, not at Hades, at the woman who threatened the position. You don't fight that hard to defend the marriage you don't consider entirely your own. The second name in the margin is gentler, and there's no punishment attached to it at all. Luce was an Oceanid, and when she died, a natural death, in the telling where this happened after the marriage rather than safely before it, Hades grieved her quietly, without drama, and planted her memory in the one place in his entire kingdom reserved for the virtuous. He turned her into a white poplar, standing among the blessed dead in the Elysian fields, a living monument to someone he'd once cared for. No confrontation recorded, no jealous queen. Just a tree still standing in a field nobody visits twice. 2 entries. Set them against Zeus's dozens, generation after generation, and the ledger still balances remarkably well for this particular household. Not spotless, no marriage, this old and this real ever is, and a story that claimed otherwise wouldn't be worth telling. Just measured fairly against everyone else on that mountain, rare. Scholars, picking through the fragments, have found a few other names mentioned in passing across the centuries. A nymph here, a minor consort there, usually in sources too thin or too late to weigh with any confidence. And it's worth being honest about that too, rather than pretending the record is cleaner than it actually is. Mythology this old was never written down all at once by a single careful hand. It accumulated region by region, century by century. Poets in one city telling a slightly different version than poets in another, and some of what accumulated simply doesn't agree with the rest. What can be said with real confidence is only what we've already walked through. 2 named, developed stories, each handled without cruelty toward the marriage itself, in a mythology where most gods left a far longer trail than that. Picture Persephone once more, if it helps to hold the whole picture together. Not in the moment of judging Minthe, not in the quiet grief over Luce, but on an ordinary evening in that hall of black stone, going over the day's arrivals with her husband, the way any 2 people who run something together might go over the day before they finally sleep. That's not a scene any surviving source gives us directly, but it's the scene the whole shape of this marriage, margin notes and all, keeps quietly pointing toward. Chapter 11, the beat it paid by a wife W shouldn't have had to. There's one more story of the living world reaching into Hades territory that deserves its own telling, separate from the others we covered earlier, because it involves a bargain even stranger than the pomegranate, and a rescue even more physically direct than Heracles wrestling Cerberus to the ground. It starts with a king named Admetus and a debt he never should have owed in the first place. Apollo, for reasons that trace back to an old offense against Zeus, was sentenced to serve as a mortal herdsman for a year, and the king he served was Admetus, who treated the god, disguised and demoted as he was, with genuine kindness and respect throughout that whole strange year, never once presuming or taking advantage of the situation the way a lesser host might have. Apollo, grateful, and perhaps also simply fond of a man who'd been decent to him when decency cost something, wanted to repay him. What Apollo eventually arranged, through his own negotiation with the Fates, the three sisters who measure and cut the thread of every mortal life, standing even above the Olympians in certain matters, was this: when Admetus's appointed hour of death arrived, he would be allowed to live on, if he could find someone else willing to die in his place. Sit with that offer for a moment, because it's a strange kind of gift, the sort that sounds generous until you actually try to use it. Admetus asked his elderly parents first, reasonably assuming that people already near the natural end of their own lives might be willing to trade a little remaining time for their son's much longer stretch of years ahead. Both of them refused. Understandably, perhaps, if not exactly heroically. Nobody, however old, finds it easy to volunteer for their own ending, even for a child they love. His wife Alcestis did not refuse. She offered herself in his place without being asked, without hesitation recorded in any surviving version of the story. And when the appointed hour came, she died so that her husband could go on living. Picture the scene the old sources give us: Admetus, alive, saved exactly as Apollo's bargain had promised, and utterly hollowed out by what saving him had actually cost, watching his own household prepare his wife's funeral instead of his. This is where Heracles enters the story, arriving at Admetus's house on his way to another of his labors, expecting the ordinary hospitality a hero could generally count on from a king he considered a friend. Admetus, in a detail that says a great deal about the particular code of hospitality this whole ancient world ran on, didn't turn him away or explain the household's grief. He hid it. Welcomed Heracles in, fed him, gave him a room, and said nothing at all about the funeral happening under the same roof, because hospitality in this culture was close to sacred, and a host's grief was never supposed to become a guest's burden. Heracles found out anyway, eventually, from a servant too honest or too grief-stricken to keep up the pretense any longer. And when he understood what his friend had actually done for him, quietly, at real cost to himself, he decided on the spot to do something about it. He went to the tomb, where Thanatos, death itself, the same figure Sisyphus had once tricked and chained, though this encounter is a very different kind of contest entirely, had come to claim the blood offering left for the newly dead, the ritual portion owed at every fresh grave. And Heracles, rather than pleading or bargaining the way Orpheus had, simply waited for Thanatos to arrive and wrestled him, physically, by force. The same blunt, direct method that had worked on Cerberus applied this time to death's own personification, gripping him bodily until Thanatos, overpowered, agreed to release Alcestis back into life. Notice carefully who Heracles actually fought here, because it matters for everything this whole chapter is really about, not Hades. Thanatos serves Hades' kingdom, carries out its collections, but he isn't Hades himself, any more than Charon or Cerberus or the three judges are. Hades doesn't appear in this particular story at all, doesn't intervene, doesn't object, doesn't need to be asked or bargained with directly the way he was for Orpheus or Heracles' earlier labor. The rule being tested here belongs to the wider structure of mortality itself, administered by Thanatos on Hades' behalf rather than by Hades personally, and Heracles' victory over Thanatos never once required challenging the king of the Underworld's own authority. That distinction is worth holding on to, because it clarifies something important about how this whole system actually worked. Hades built the kingdom, set its rules, ruled its court, but he wasn't personally present at every single deathbed collecting every single soul himself. He had a structure for that, officials and functions distributed the way any well-run kingdom distributes its actual daily labor. Thanatos did the collecting. Hades held the throne the collections ultimately answered to. And when Heracles beat Thanatos in a wrestling match at a tomb, he wasn't defying Hades at all. He was simply proving, once again, exactly what we already know about him from Cerberus. That raw strength, honestly applied, without trickery, could occasionally, rarely, bend even death's own machinery, and that the machinery's ultimate owner never seemed to consider that a threat worth taking personally. Alcestis returned to her husband, alive, and the story, at least in the version that survives most completely, the one written for the stage centuries later, ends with something close to a happy reunion, Admetus overwhelmed with a grief and gratitude too large to easily hold at once. His wife restored to him at the cost of another god's wrestling match, rather than any bargain he himself had struck. What this whole story adds to the larger picture of Hades' realm, sitting here near the end of tonight's telling, is a reminder worth carrying forward. The Underworld's boundary got tested more than once, by more than one method, across the whole span of this mythology. Grief and music moved it, briefly, for Orpheus. Their strength moved it, briefly, for Heracles twice over, once against the dog itself, once against death's own personification at a graveside. Honest asking moved it, briefly, for the same Heracles when he simply requested Cerberus outright. And every single time, without exception, the boundary closed back up again exactly where it had always been immediately afterward, because a boundary that can be moved permanently isn't really a boundary at all. It's just a suggestion, and Hades, across the entirety of this long story, never once ran his kingdom on suggestions. Chapter 12. The hero went down just to ask a question. There's one more living visitor worth spending real time with tonight, and his reason for going down is different from every other name we've covered so far. He didn't go for love the way Orpheus didn't go for glory or to complete an assigned labor the way Heracles did twice over. He went because he was lost, in the most literal, practical sense. A sailor can be lost, and he needed directions that only the dead could give him. Odysseus, on his long, cursed voyage home from Troy, was told by the witch goddess Circe that before he could find his way back to Ithaca, he needed to travel to the edge of the underworld and consult the blind prophet Tiresias, who alone among the dead retained his full mind and memory even in death, and who alone could tell him the specific path his journey still needed to take. Notice right away something different about how this visit works compared to every other one we've covered tonight. Odysseus doesn't walk through Hades' actual gates, doesn't stand before the god himself, the way Orpheus and Heracles and Theseus each did in their own ways. He performs a ritual instead, at the very edge of the world, at a place where the boundary between the living and the dead runs thin enough to be reached without fully crossing it. He digs a pit, pours offerings of honey and milk and wine and water into it, and finally lets the blood of sacrificed animals flow down into the trench, and the shades of the dead, drawn by the scent and substance of that blood, begin to gather around him in the gloom, eager for the one thing that lets them briefly speak and think clearly again. Picture that scene properly, because it's one of the eeriest and most quietly moving passages in the whole of ancient literature, and it deserves better than a passing mention. Odysseus, a sword drawn and held ready across the pit, keeping the crowding shades back until Tiresias himself arrives to drink first and speak first, the way the ritual demands. And around him, pressing close in the dark, shade after shade after shade. Some he recognizes, most he doesn't. An entire crowd of the dead reaching toward a small pool of blood, the way a starving crowd reaches toward bread. Tiresias comes forward, drinks and speaks, gives Odysseus the warnings and directions he actually came for, about the cattle of the sun god that must not be touched, about the suitors waiting back home who must eventually be dealt with, about the long, strange peace that waits for him even further beyond that. And once the prophecy is delivered, Odysseus allows other shades to approach the blood, one at a time, and speak with him. His own mother is among them, Anticlea, who had been alive when he left for Troy and had died of grief in his absence. Something he didn't know until this exact moment, in this exact dark place, hearing it from her own restored voice. He tries 3 times to embrace her, and 3 times his arms close on nothing at all, because a shade has no more substance than smoke or a dream. However clearly it speaks, however familiar the voice sounds. That failed embrace, repeated 3 times, is one of the quietest, saddest images in the whole of Homer, and it says something worth sitting with about the actual texture of Hades' realm that no amount of description of rivers and gates quite manages to capture on its own. The dead are there, and they can speak, and they remember you, and you still cannot hold them. That's the whole grief of the place, distilled into one small failed gesture, repeated 3 times in the dark. And then Achilles. This is the moment from the whole scene that survived longest in cultural memory, quoted and requoted for nearly 3,000 years because of what it reveals about how even a hero as celebrated as Achilles, killed young, mourned across the entire Greek world, actually felt about the fate that had claimed him. Odysseus, meaning it is comfort, tells Achilles that he was honored like a god while he lived and remains honored among the dead now that he's died. Achilles' answer is not comforted at all. He tells Odysseus plainly, without any of the heroic polish the living world had wrapped around his memory, that he would rather be a poor, landless servant working for the meanest living farmer above the earth than rule as king over the entirety of the dead below it. Sit with that for a long moment, because it's arguably the single most important line in this entire chapter, maybe in this entire night. This is Achilles, the greatest warrior of his whole age, a man who chose glory and an early death over a long, quiet, unremarkable life, and who got exactly what he'd chosen, telling Odysseus from the other side of that choice that he'd take it back if he could. Not because the underworld is cruel, not because Hades has mistreated him in any specific way, simply because it is not life, however comfortable a particular soul's portion of it might be, and no honor, no glory, no permanent fame carried back among the living can fill that particular absence. This is worth holding next to everything else we've spent tonight establishing about Hades' character, because it complicates the picture in an important, honest way, exactly the way a story this careful ought to let itself be complicated. Hades runs a fair kingdom, a consistent one, a kingdom built without cruelty, without favoritism, administered by judges who cannot be bribed, and rules that never bend for rank. All of that is true, and none of it is undone by what Achilles says here. But fairness was never the same thing as comfort, and a system built with total integrity can still be, for the person living inside it, an unbearable diminishment of everything they were. Achilles isn't accusing Hades of mistreating him. He's simply telling the truth about what death costs, even administered as fairly as it possibly could be. That distinction matters, and it's worth carrying forward as we head toward the end of tonight's story. This whole night has been building a case for Hades' fairness, his restraint, his consistency, compared to his far more chaotic brothers. None of that is a claim that death itself is good or comfortable, or anything other than the loss it has always been to the people who actually experience it. Hades administers that loss without cruelty. He does not, and never could, make the loss itself painless. Achilles, from the other side of it, makes sure we remember the difference. Odysseus speaks with a few more shades before the crowd grows too large and too insistent for him to safely remain. Ajax, still bitter and silent over an old rivalry even in death, refusing to speak to him at all. A grudge apparently strong enough to survive even this. Agamemnon, murdered by his own wife upon his return home, warning Odysseus bitterly about the dangers of trusting too easily. And finally, as the shades press closer and the pit's power begins to feel like it might overwhelm him entirely, Odysseus retreats, back up toward his ship, back toward the world of the living, carrying with him everything Tiresias told him, and the particular, hard-won knowledge that comes only from having spoken, briefly, with the actual dead, rather than simply having heard stories about them. Hades himself never appears directly in this whole scene, worth noting as we close this chapter. This wasn't an audience with the king. It was a conversation at the very edge of his territory, conducted through ritual rather than through royal permission. The dead drawn briefly to the surface world's blood, rather than a living man walking fully into the palace itself. And maybe that's fitting, in its own way, for the chapter of this whole story that isn't really about Hades' character at all, but about what his kingdom actually feels like from the inside, to the people who live there now, forever, whatever kind of king happens to be running it. Chapter 13. The one time he bled. There's a single strange line, easy to miss if you're not reading closely, tucked into Homer's Iliad, that deserves its own moment tonight, because it's the only place in the entire surviving mythology where Hades himself, not a servant, not Cerberus, but Hades in his own body, is described taking a wound. It happened at Pylos, in a conflict that predates the Trojan War by a generation or more, when Heracles, the same hero who would later wrestle Cerberus and Thanatos both, was making war on the city for reasons that have nothing directly to do with the underworld at all. Old grievances between mortal kings and a hero with a long memory for slights. Hades, for reasons the sources don't fully explain, was present among the defenders, fighting alongside the mortals of Pylos and Heracles in the chaos of that battle, drew his bow and struck him. The wound landed in the shoulder, Homer tells us, and it caused Hades genuine pain sharp enough that he left the battlefield entirely and traveled all the way up to Olympus itself to be healed by Paeon, the physician of the gods, who applied herbs and salves to close the wound the way you'd tend to any injury, divine or otherwise. Sit with the strangeness of that scene for a moment, because it's genuinely one of the odder images in the whole of Greek mythology, and it rarely gets the attention it deserves. A god who rules literal death, who administers an eternity of consequence to every mortal who ever lived, traveling to Olympus with an arrow wound, wincing presumably the way anyone winces when a physician works on a fresh injury, receiving ordinary medical care from a colleague the same way Ares or Aphrodite might after a rough day on some other battlefield entirely. It's worth asking what this single strange scene is actually doing in the mythology, because myths this old rarely include a detail without some reason, even if the reason has faded from view by the time it reaches us. One reading, and probably the simplest one, is just a reminder that the gods of this pantheon, however powerful, were never quite invulnerable in the absolute sense a modern reader might expect. They could be hurt. They could bleed something close to blood. Ichor, technically in most tellings, a golden substance distinct from mortal blood, but a wound all the same. Even Hades, ruler of the one realm nothing escapes, could be caught by a well-aimed arrow from a mortal hero determined enough to draw his bow against a god. There's a second reading worth holding alongside the first, though, because it fits so neatly with everything else this whole night has been building toward. Notice what Hades does with the wound. He doesn't retaliate against Heracles on the spot, in the heat of that battle, the way you might expect a god struck by a mortal to react. He doesn't curse Pylos or hunt Heracles down afterward in fury, or hold the injury against him going forward, and we know he didn't, because this is the same Hades who would later, in that entirely separate encounter over Cerberus, treat Heracles fairly, set honest terms, and honor the outcome without a trace of old resentment. Whatever pain that arrow caused him at Pylos, it apparently didn't calcify into a grudge, the way an injury like that so often does with the more volatile gods in this same mythology. He simply went and got it treated and moved on. And years later, when the same hero came asking a genuine favor, judged him purely on the honesty of that request, rather than on an old wound from a completely different fight. That's a small detail, buried in one line of one ancient epic, easy to read past entirely if you're not looking for it. But it's worth carrying forward tonight because it's one more brick in the same wall this whole story keeps building. A god who could be heard, who was heard at least once on record, and who somehow still managed not to let that hurt define how he treated the person who caused it the very next time they stood in front of him. Chapter 4. The name that outlasted the Templars. Every god in this pantheon eventually stopped being worshipped. The temples emptied, the sacrifices stopped. The old rituals at Eleusis finally closed for good sometime in the late 4th century, after more than 1,000 years of continuous practice, when a Christianizing empire no longer had room for them. You'd expect a figure like Hades, tied so tightly to a specific ancient religious structure, to fade along with everything else once that structure came down. He didn't, not really. He just changed shape and kept going, in ways worth spending a little time with before we close out tonight. The most direct inheritor of his territory, structurally if not by name, was Dante Alighieri, writing in the early 1300s, well over 1,000 years after the Homeric hymns first fixed Persephone's story into something like its familiar shape. Dante's Inferno doesn't use Hades as a character at all. This is a Christian underworld, structured around Christian sin and Christian judgment, but the architecture he builds owes an unmistakable debt to the one Hades laid down first. Circles instead of rivers, but still a descending structure. Still punishments matched with unsettling precision to the specific sins that earned them. An approach that traces directly back to Tantalus, starving within reach of fruit, and Ixion spinning on his wheel. Even Charon shows up by name, ferrying souls across Dante's own river, a direct, deliberate borrowing from a mythology that was, by Dante's time, already many centuries out of active religious practice, kept alive purely as literature and cultural memory rather than living belief. That borrowing tells you something worth noticing. Even a culture that had entirely replaced Hades' actual theology still reached for his structural logic when it needed to imagine judgment fairly, not cruelty distributed randomly. Punishment fitted precisely to crime. That's Hades' real inheritance, arguably more durable than any specific ritual or any specific name people once used to address him. Centuries later, when the field of psychology started developing its own vocabulary for the parts of a person that stay hidden, unseen, working beneath the visible surface of ordinary daily life, the underworld became one of its most natural metaphors, almost immediately. Carl Jung, in particular, drew heavily on the structure of this exact myth when describing what he called the unconscious, the vast, mostly invisible territory beneath a person's conscious awareness, holding memory, instinct, everything the visible daylight mind chooses not to look at directly. Persephone's descent and return became, in Jung's own framework and in the work of many psychologists who followed him, a way of describing the necessary, cyclical work of confronting what's been buried, spending time with it, and eventually returning changed by having done so. The god of the unseen, quite literally, became a working metaphor for everything a person keeps unseen inside themselves,